Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. For episode 34, we are joined in the studios of OPB by an impressive brain trust hailing from two different continents, which is fortunate because we will be tackling some hard-hitting topics if you're a foodie. We will start with microbes and mold, move on to spontaneous fermentation, and then discuss the urban-rural divide as it affects the food world. Here in the studios of OPB, we've got Bronwen Percival, author of Reinventing the Wheel, Milk, Microbes, and the Fight for Real Cheese, and also an editor of the James Beard Award-winning Oxford Companion to Cheese and the cheese buyer for Neal's Yard Dairy in London. Welcome, Bronwen.
It's great to be here, Catherine.
And we're also joined by her husband and co-author, Francis Percival, who is the food editor and a columnist for The World of Fine Wine, and along with Bronwen, is a co-founder of the London Gastronomy Seminars. I can't talk today. So good to see you, Francis.
Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here. Thank you, Catherine.
And returning panelist, Christian Debenedetti, author of the books The Great American Ale Trail and Beer Bites, and the founder and head brewer of Wolves and People Farmhouse Brewery in Newberg, Oregon. Hello.
Hi, Catherine.
And now for our first topic. Microbes and mold make for real food. Most Americans would avoid eating any food if its label stated that it contains microbes or mold. But Bronwen, your new book has the word microbes right in the title. For those of our listeners who might be a little bit hesitant about the idea of digesting microbes and molds, can you explain to us what they are and what they do for the foods we eat?
Absolutely. I think it is true that here in the United States and also in much of Europe, our food system and our society in general has developed a really antagonistic relationship with microbes. And the truth is that in a pre-modern world, we depended really heavily on microbes and molds to preserve a lot of the foods that we were eating. And so I work with cheese, and cheese, like so many other foods, is a fermented one. We could include things like bread and wine and cider, as we're going to be talking about in a little while. But microbes perform a really important role in these foods in terms of, first of all, fermenting them. In the case of cheese, we have bacteria which transform sweet sugars within the milk into lactic acid, which is quite sour and which prevents the growth of other spoilage microbes. And then we rely on bacteria and molds to actually develop flavor as those cheeses mature. Without microbes, we wouldn't have cheese in the first place, and we certainly would be not denied access to a really wide and wonderful variety of flavors.
Now, but we hear that you're only supposed to eat cheese that has been pasteurized. Can you explain what that means?
Absolutely. So pasteurization is a treatment for milk, which essentially heats it very quickly up to the temperature that's required to kill the most heat-insensitive pathogen. So pathogens are organisms that can cause illness in people. And so if you're producing milk under unsanitary conditions or from the milk of sick animals, it could contain pathogens. And pasteurization is a really interesting and useful control point in those circumstances where you can't be absolutely sure about your upstream controls. However, it is absolutely possible to produce milk under conditions that can assure the absence of pathogens, and that's what's necessary if you're going to be making raw milk cheese. And the other thing that I think is really important to mention here is that pasteurization will wipe the slate clean at the point when the cheese-making process is starting, but there is also such a thing as contamination that can take place after pasteurization. Really, if you're concerned about cheese safety, it's more to do with the capability of that cheese as a medium to grow bacteria. And if you're talking about something like a hard cheddar or a Parmigiano Reggiano, that cheese is not going to be a nice environment to grow pathogens. They're dry, they're acid, they're salty, they're hard. It's sort of like a desert for microbes.
Yes, I just to interject in what Bronwen said, pasteurization is a brilliant intervention if you are going to sell fluid milk. In that one, if you know that milk in that carton or in that bottle, you can pasteurize it, and then it's sterile, and then you've killed the pathogens or any potential pathogens, and you have something that will be safe and will have a shelf life that's appropriate for your product. So one of Bronwen's cheesemakers likes to say, it's sort of, if I dumped a load of feces in a cup of milk and then pasteurized it for you, it would be completely safe. But would you want to eat it?
No. Or drink it.
Or make a smoothie or anything like that.
Would it require a straw?
Yeah, exactly. It would require a straw and a blender, and yeah, it would be delicious. But I think it becomes this interesting thing that one of the reasons why raw milk cheeses are so compelling is in order to produce them well, everything has to be done perfectly. And this becomes interesting because you have the opportunity for complete transparency for you as the consumer into the farming decisions that the farmer has made. As soon as you insert that kill stage, well, those farming decisions are no longer quite as important. It's no longer quite as important for you to be as scrupulous in your milking practice. The health of your herd is no longer quite as important because you've got something which will look after it. We can fix that in post-production. And this demands absolute authenticity. So it's almost like if the equivalent of going to the theatre versus watching a superhero movie. That no one expects that the Hulk exists because animators have animated him. Whereas if you're going to the theatre and you're watching that performance, or if you're going to a live concert and you're watching someone actually do it, there is no safety net. They have to be able to do it perfectly themselves. They can't just rely on someone to fill it in.
Oh, I love that metaphor, Francis. I'm going to keep that in mind every time I eat raw cheese. So, Christian, with beer, aren't mass-produced beers pasteurized?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Most are. It depends on what you call mass-produced, and these days the line is, getting blurrier. It really depends on the size of the operation, but pasteurization absolutely happens. But to go back to what Francis was saying about the sort of arresting the microbial character at a certain point is something that drives us far away from pasteurization at this stage of the brewery that we run, because we want very much to see that invisible process sort of silently march on to tease that out and find where it's going to end up and capture that energy in a bottle. Pasteurization would certainly freeze that beer in time. So, but it's happening all the time. And frankly, it's a very hot button topic right now. There are huge lawsuits going on in Colorado. I won't mention the brewery or the yeast company involved, but there's a $2 million suit between a very widely respected craft brewery and a commercial yeast company over the alleged purity or impurity of the yeast that they use in the brewery. And there's a lot on the line, and I won't weigh in on it because I don't know enough about it, but it's really a big topic in beer these days, the presence and action of yeast and microbes of all kinds.
Absolutely. I think it's a really interesting point that you're making, Christian, because I think a lot of modern food production really rests on this idea that there's certain microbes that are useful, and we can basically wipe the slate clean and just add back the 1 or 2 or 3 strains that we've identified that can do this very particular role.
Robin, it's the classic thing you hear, and I hear it from winemakers, you hear it from cheesemakers. If you want a microbe in your name product, I'll put it there myself.
That just seems wrong somehow. It seems like it should just happen organically.
Absolutely. And the truth is that if you're working with well-produced raw materials, it will. And because those raw materials will have a variety of different microbes that are unique to the area in which they're produced, you're going to end up with something that tastes more complex and more interesting than if you're just wiping the slate clean and adding back 1 or 2. It's an inherent simplification. It's good if you want to be able to produce millions of units of this thing that you can put on the shelf of every supermarket and know that a customer will have the same experience over and over and over again and be able to do it for a cheap price. But in terms of actually the integrity and the interest of the food, I think you're sacrificing something quite important.
I think to go back to Christian's question about scale, we could give you 2 answers. The first answer, which I think is the most compellingly romantic, is you can't do it at scale, and that's exactly the point. That's how inherently subversive a lot of these things are, because they deny you scalability. They prevent large-scale manufacture. You encourage diversity, particularly if you're looking to get the unique flavors that come from small farms. Then this is your direct route route to commercial sustainability. The French, because the French are very smart in some cheese regions, and here I'm thinking particularly of somewhere like Normandy in the north of France, which is the home of Camembert. And Camembert is a style of cheese where the culture of production is almost entirely very large facilities that might be making hundreds of thousands of cheeses a day. And if they're operating within the appellation, so to make the highest category of Camembert de Normandie, they are required to make raw milk cheese. And they do it, and this is what blows our minds as Anglo-Saxons thinking about it. They do it with milk that they source from hundreds of different farms and pull together. And the fundamental rule within the dairy industry is you're only as clean as your dirtiest cow. So you can imagine that once you try scaling that sort of a system, you expose yourself to these great risks. If you're then making a Camembert, one of the most potentially microbially permissive cheeses, as Bronwen says, a great petri dish in which to grow whatever nasty that might be there, then you're exposing yourself to this tremendous potential risk, and yet they make it as a raw milk cheese. I don't know if Bronwen wants to weigh in on some of the mechanisms that they have to use to ensure the absence of pathogens.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things is that when you're operating without a safety net like that, you're relying quite a lot on controlling the way those upstream inputs, the way people are farming, really ensuring that people are doing things that to a farmer from working in the UK look obsessive. Look, when we were touring those farms, they were operating at a level of hygiene that was really, they were feeding their cows off of surfaces that had been epoxied so that there was no place for dust to hide. It was operating at a high level of sanitation. I do think that it's amazing the tricks that you can do when you are working in that way. But in a way, the moment you're combining the milk of hundreds of farms, you're not making something that's unique to a single farm. You're making something that is, again, a sort of a cheese that is driven by the starter cultures they're adding rather than expressing a single place. And for me, cheese is at its most interesting when it's doing something unique. But really, to get back to your original question, which was about our relationship with microbes as a society, I think we're sort of at a turning point right now, because I think there's a lot of really interesting new scientific findings that are coming out that are actually demonstrating the ways in which we have been relying on microbial diversity without even realizing it for the longest time.
Yeah, we're all learning now we're supposed to have a diverse biome in our gut, right?
Absolutely. I think what Catherine's original question was if they knew they were digesting something containing microbes. And yet we as humans, the reason we are the world's greatest omnivore is because we've largely outsourced our digestion to microbes. And that because you have the microbes doing the work of digesting that food for you, and because their generation time is so short, because that microbial environment can evolve so quickly, we could leave wonderful green Oregon and go to the Australian outback and eat a diet of fibrous tubers and berries that we forage and as many kangaroos as we could catch, and our guts could cope. Because the population within your gut would change. If we had to rely on changing our actual physical being, we've just been talking about people having children. If you think what the generation time in humans is, if we relied sort of on 30 years to make a selective choice amongst humans, we'd never be able to live anywhere else. We'd be stuck in the single environment that we're adapted to, where we can digest food. By outsourcing it to microbes, we have this astonishing flexibility and capacity to eat a diversity of different things and to live all over the world. It's really cool science. You just look at it and it's a brilliant solution to these problems.
Well, that's a great transition to our next topic, which is spontaneous fermentation. I think what you're saying by saying that the microbes are sort of outsourcing the first layer of digestion for us, you're you're basically referring to fermentation, right? The process in which a large microbe such as yeast would sort of break down something and make it more digestible?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think spontaneous fermentation captures everything that we were talking about in our first course, where we were talking about how you have the capacity to capture a unique microbiome of say, your farm. If you're a food producer, and then with your sensitive cheese making or your sensitive wine making or your sensitive whatever else you're making, using your own microbes to arrive at those unique flavors.
Now, Christian, we got to hear from you, because you are brewing beer in your family's old hazelnut barn on your family farm. So tell me about the yeasts and microbes that are living there.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine. It's it's a very interesting topic in our brewery. The presence of microbes certainly surrounding us in the building itself, which was built in 1912 and has housed all these other operations over the years, from a little winery to an oak barrel cooperage, and now a brewery. And we have this area in the corner of the barn that we call the yeast lab. It's really not a lab at all, but a collection of these scary-looking jars full of wild yeasts and microbes growing in various mediums that we kind of wrangle. And I should start off by saying, as far as spontaneous fermentation is concerned, I would definitely not pose as an expert in this topic. In beer, it's a very, very new and specialized world of scientific discovery that is building on centuries of brewing tradition. So going back to what Bronwen was saying about specialized practices and honing in on your practice and your method of making a beer in order to achieve the greatest results at the end, means you can have both a super sanitary situation in a creamery or in a cheese making operation. The same is true in our brewery. We have areas which are sanitized with peracetic acid and caustic acid that are, you could eat dinner off of, and absolutely perfectly microbially free, for the reason that we are guiding later in the process or at key moments these very uncontrolled microbes and bringing them into the process in an intentional way. And
but wait, go back to these jars. So can you explain this to us, for those of us who can't quite envision what this is? So are you going around your brewery or your property and collecting yeasts, and how do you do that?
Yeah, we have. So, and this is a really cool thing that's going on around the country right now, a whole movement and around the world, I would say, the backyard biologist sort of movement of there are guys who send out petri dishes and encourage homebrewers to go and collect yeast samples from the skins of fruit in their neighborhood or in their own backyards, grow them up, and then send those in order to create a kind of giant microbial map of the nation. So it's very cool that homebrewers are sort of leading this effort. On our farm and in our property, the first thing I did when I was getting ready to start the brewery was stick a sample of wort or unfermented beer into the crook of a plum tree, which is the oldest tree on the farm, oldest fruit tree that we know of on the farm. I let it ferment spontaneously over the next 4 days, and it started smelling really good. And this is where the lab comes in, and everyone does this differently. Again, I'm no expert. It's a lot of experimentation going on, which is the fun part. But in this case, I sent that sample to a lab in San Diego. They isolated and analyzed, did a DNA reading on the entire thing. It's called a scorpion machine, which they use. And this is a very important tool for winemakers as well, to kind of find what's going on in native and natural wines. Anyway, several weeks later, I get this letter back and an analysis of the yeast. And it was very interesting because there were all kinds of things present, including wild Saccharomyces, including lactic bacteria that might have come from my brewing equipment or being inside the barn at any time, lactobacillus, including kind of unknown and unnamed strains of wild Saccharomyces. So. And that is not the only strain we use in the brewery. We use a lot, and we are working on in the future of isolating wild yeast from honey that we plan to grow on the farm, because honeybees are a great vector for moving microbes around in a natural place. They're coated in it, and so that's very fun. And we've grown it from pine cones, fir needles, from the flowers of filbert trees, and we're just experimenting. Some of these really, frankly, go nowhere, and others we've been really happy with the results. So it's fun. It's a fun experiment, and we invite brewers who are really good at spontaneous brewing as well to come and brew with us sometimes and see what we can learn from them.
Now, Francis, you and I both cover wine. I feel like there's a little subtlety there in that winemakers probably wouldn't call it spontaneous if they were introducing a honey yeast.
Yeah, I think this is the...
We wouldn't call that spontaneous either.
Oh, you wouldn't? Okay.
The idea of just fermenting whatever you're going to ferment with the microbes that are already there, that by picking ripe fruit and having your fruit in good hygienic condition and then keeping it in an environment where it will ferment quite happily by itself, you're building the house which will attract the appropriate microbes for whatever task you're directing it towards. For me, the thing that always blows my mind in terms of spontaneous fermentation or native microbe fermentation is kimchi. Mm-hmm. That all kimchi, at whatever level of Korean cooking that you're operating at, is made using its own native microbes. There is no such thing as an inoculated fermentation in kimchi production.
I mean, there are people who are working on it. But
in
a way, you sort of wonder why do you need to step in and create a solution for a problem that you're not having. Mm-hmm. But, and that's the beauty of the selective environment. There have been some really, really interesting papers that have looked at the microbiome of fresh vegetables. And to be honest,
it's the cabbage that's going to come and kill you. Raw cabbage is a thing of terror. The potential pathogens on a raw cabbage.
There are a lot of interesting and, a very interesting what we call opportunistic pathogens, microbes that have been associated with disease that are associated with fresh vegetables because they're opportunistic pathogens absolutely everywhere in our world. And, I think the really interesting thing is I think we've been living this lie that says when you clean a surface, it's sterile, whereas actually, even though sterility is a word that maybe we might use in making cheese or food about talking, okay, now I'm going to sterilize this piece of equipment. This is not the way the world works. And actually, when they've done some interesting, the Dutton Lab, who are looking at cheese rind microbes as a sort of interesting model community for understanding how microbes communicate and interact with one another, the first step in this really interesting research project they did was to analyze the rind communities on 130-something artisan cheeses. And what Christian was saying about the sort of interesting places where these microbes were being found and moving around between different environments was really interesting because on the surfaces of those cheeses, they were finding microbes that had only ever been identified before in places like Antarctic sea ice. Things that you would never think, why is that on this sort of washed rind cheese?
There's it's so funny to think about Antarctica, right, as a place for yeast frozen or frozen in an iceberg. A lot of brewers are kind of one-upping each other all the time these days, which can be annoying, but also can be great. And one of the results of some recent experiments with spontaneous fermentation, and just to go back, which is to say, for exposing raw beer, unfermented beer, completely to the air in a given area, and adding no yeast whatsoever. So, and then letting nature take its course. So there, a recent one I read about is some guys from Arizona teaming up with brewers in Amsterdam to put what's called a cool ship or an open fermentation vessel. It can look like a big dairy tank, and they loaded it onto a barge in Amsterdam and drove it around. Boated it around in the canals of Amsterdam for a whole afternoon, whilst drinking plenty of beer, and enjoying themselves and filming the whole thing, and just having a bit of fun. But the brewers involved are super, super accomplished, and it was kind of a cheeky video, but also some of the beers that both companies have made have been totally world class. So, and then you have these more sort of austere and very serious things happening in spontaneous fermentation, and people forming societies and setting down rules. So it's, which to me, frankly, is not the direction we want to go in. We don't want to be a member of a club that would have us as a member.
I think Christian's got a very interesting point there, but what I would just underline is a lot of this research on finding microbes in interesting and unexpected places is suggesting that actually it's not so much the driving of that cool ship around Amsterdam that's going to select for sort of Amsterdam's ambient yeasts. It's more the actual physical conditions you're building within that unfermented beer that will allow certain things to grow. This is, I think, the interesting thing with the things I found in deep sea vents and things like that.
No, absolutely. That being a good beer maker or being a good cheese maker is about creating that selective environment. And you do want a lot of diversity in that raw material that you're starting out with. So you have a good opportunity to get some really interesting things that are potentially going to grow. But then the art of the brewer or the cheesemaker is to create that selective environment, or the kimchi maker for that matter, that then encourages the microbes that are the best suited and the ones that are going to be the most interesting to grow and really express themselves. And so you could probably take, you can take these vegetables that are covered with, a few lactic acid bacteria and some quite scary things and pack them into a jar in an anaerobic environment with the right amount of salt and leave them for 2 weeks. And that creates an environment that basically obliterates anything that could hurt you and that you end up with something that's really flavorful and wonderful.
And I think thinking about pathogens, we always think of pathogens as if they're these great predators of the microbial environment sitting there waiting to ambush a person. Whereas pathogens really are, or potential pathogens, they're microbes growing in places where you don't want them to grow. Yeah. It's things like microbes that would make an entirely delicious cheese rind growing on the inside of your lung. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a problem. Whereas if it's growing in the right place, then it's fine.
Michael Pollan has that theory that we're all just working for the microbes. They're really in charge, and we're just sort of carrying them around so they can go about, digesting the world.
Slaves of Lactococcus lactis, yeah. Absolutely.
And thank you for using the word delicious, Francis, because I think sometimes we geek out so much about this, we forget, at least with wine, you and I have probably observed that wines where the yeast is a commercial yeast that's just dumped in, often that wine will have sort of a candy aroma and flavor. It's just sort of a little bit, there's something, I don't want to say fake because there are great wines that are made with commercial yeast, but there's something about a spontaneously fermented wine that just, there's an authenticity to it, there's a purity to it, the flavors are more sort of farmy. I don't know how
Catherine,
else to say it.
Absolutely. I really couldn't agree more. I think the potential for unique flavors, for everyone not having the same flavors. Mm-hmm. So when you see, perhaps in the dairy industry, culture houses, these biotech firms that produce the selected strains of microbes that most people will use to ferment their cheese, and also for the yeasts and molds and bacteria that will ripen the cheese. And where everybody uses the same strains, the cheeses taste the same. Mm-hmm. And we even joke in the UK, one of the agents of one of these companies has a nice, the people who break the very, very large orders down into something that's small enough for a small scale, for an artisan or a farmhouse producer to use, they have a nice sideline selling cake mix. And it really is essentially, it's possible to make with these very dominant, particularly these very dominant ripening strains of bacteria that will give you very pronounced flavor profiles. Betty Crocker cheese where you just open that packet and add milk, and you will get something that has an entirely predictable flavor profile, and that can be really delicious.
Right.
The problem is
once in a while,
if they all taste the same.
Well, on that note, Christian brought, I think, an unpredictable beer. Am I right?
I did, yeah. Speaking of delicious, it's not a spontaneous beer, but it comes from a brewery called Jester King in Austin, Texas. And it's a collaboration with the Honey Board, which provided honey. So
there are beautiful bees on the label.
Yeah, there's some bees on the label. So I'm going to open this, and hopefully it doesn't foam all over the place. But, oh, yeah, that's a good sound, right? But you mentioned, setting the framework and any ingredients for the right things to happen. In beer, it's hops. Hops are antimicrobial, and honey is as well, which is an interesting thing for this beer. This is a blend of a bunch of barrel-aged beers. And and then honey that came from hives outside of Austin. And so I was recently down there and went to visit some of the hives and the apiary. And a lot of brewers are really getting into the honey thing. It's super fun. So this is a beer that kind of crosses all of the topics we're looking at today. And the spontaneous beers are super hard to get, but that's something that Jester King is really, really great about doing, and I'm very inspired by their process and what they do. And going back to the idea of a culture, a house culture, if you will, which you'll find, I'm sure, certain great, cheesemakers, and in honey these days as well, the idea of terroir coming out in a brewery is sort of resident house yeast culture. So at Jester King, as in many other breweries, and particularly in Belgium, yes, they are using an open-air fermenter called a coolship, sending in this turbid mash of unmalted wheat and brewer's barley and so forth, and opening it to the air. But in that brewery itself, on the walls, in the rafters, in the cobwebs between the barrels, and this is where they get very romantic to visit these old breweries, is living a lot of the rye yeast, frankly, because they're on everything. There's no way you could, they're 5 millimeters into the cellulose of an oak barrel. You just can't get them out. And so many cool studies about how this all works, and it's all very mysterious still on the 20 or 30 different yeasts and bacteria that will transform some of these beers. But it's really, really interesting to just watch that, and we're all learning, and everyone is, kind of trading information and inspiring. So it used to be exceedingly rare to have a spontaneous beer or much wild yeast in beer at all, and now it's par for the course, frankly. It's kind of like restaurants used to have. It used to be a big deal to get like a wood oven, right? Mm-hmm. And now there's a wood oven in every great restaurant, right? Because they use oak or whatever. But they're still literally playing with fire. You could burn the entire dinner and disappoint everybody. And wild yeast in breweries, I think, is very similar. You could really screw it up if you don't know what you're doing. And the wilder and more spontaneous you go, the higher the risk factor.
It's so interesting hearing you talking about that sort of biofilm on the wood and its role in inoculating the wort for the beer, because there are cheeses that are made in a very similar way. A cheese in particular
with spiders
that we start our book with, this cheese called Salaire Tradition, and the way in which it's made is they take the raw milk, the cows are milked in the field, and the milk goes directly into these sort of wooden barrels that are never washed. They never see a cleaning chemical. They just rinse them out with the whey at the end of the day. And in response to the health authorities sort of cracking down on this practice, because, of course, it flies in the face of everything that we think about sanitizable materials and EU law and so forth, they called in a group of microbiologists to look at these cheese-making barrels and figure out what was going on with them. And they actually determined that they were acting as these sort of natural starter factories, that those biofilms, which, are maintained with the use of this raw milk from cows that are milked right in the middle, out in the open, they are actually housing all of the microbes that are needed to make really interesting, delicious cheese. Not just bacteria, but yeasts. And that whole population, it's stable. It's maintained within the barrels. So when they're making cheese twice a day, it's continually, this population is evolving, and you're getting cheese that comes out of those barrels that you couldn't make anywhere else. And as a result, the cheese commands this incredibly high price, but it's worth it because it's really delivering something totally interesting and unique.
Well, Bronwen, I hate to cut into this conversation. It's so fascinating, but I think we need to move on. You mentioned the authorities in the EU, so that's a good transition to our third topic, which is the urban-rural divide vis-a-vis the food and beverage industry. There's a massive urban and rural political divide right now, both in the U.S. and the U.K., with rural residents far more likely to have voted for Brexit or for Donald Trump than city dwellers. But as those of us who work in the artisanal food industries know, the policies that come with these votes actually harm the industries that are in many cases propping up these agrarian communities. There's so much here, but Christian Debenedetti, I thought maybe we could just start on your kind of everyday level. You have a farmhouse brewery operating out of an old hazelnut barn 21 miles southwest of Portland. So you're constantly kind of going back and forth. I'm guessing your customers, a lot of them are urban dwellers. I'm wondering if you feel like a palpable sense of tension between the old-time farming community there and the kind of the gourmands who are moving in and coming to visit.
Oh, that's a fascinating question. I mean, we really get both. And I would say that Newburgh, as a classic example of a small-town American town, a mill town, the most churches per capita in the United States up until the 60s. Yeah, it's a Quaker town, a very conservative farming area, but over time, things have changed, and this is happening across the country in rural areas everywhere, where you're having an influx of people who maybe choose to eat differently or support a small co-op or a CSA to get their vegetables or their beef and lamb and pork, and this is certainly happening at the brewery where we are. But we have a mix of fans that are both local, literally walking down the country lane to our place, and people who come from Portland and further afield. And there's a lot of romance, I think. They feel like, oh, this place is great. I can sit on this picnic table and just stare off into the distance. And then when you live there and you make beer there every day, sometimes you, gosh, I really need to get out of here and get into Portland and see some people and go to some restaurants. But Newburgh has those things now too. And so I think it's a very interesting time that we're living in, where people are romanticizing, but for very good reasons, life in the country. And we have a very cool relationship with local farmers too. The guy that takes our spent grain is a pig farmer, and he's so happy to come and pick up 600 or 800 pounds of grain every time we brew and take it back and feed his pigs. So there's a lot of sort of symbiosis there. We try to get as many ingredients from local farms as well. There's a farmer who lives a mile away who comes in when she has something ripe. It's fantastic. And she calls and says, hey, I've got huckleberries, I've got josta berries, I've got golden raspberries, I've let me bring it down. And we're small enough that we can take those things and be sort of like one crop, one batch at a time. And it's really fun.
So you really are kind of supporting the local economy.
Well, hopefully.
By being there, and yet I'm guessing your customers, a lot of them are coming from the city. Yeah,
it's both. It's definitely both. It's a bit of a long drive, but once people get out there, they're glad they made the trip. So, but for every brewery, the most important culture as far as your customers is the local. As someone who will come in when it's pouring rain, and when there's 2 feet of snow, they'll come down the road and pull in and have a beer. So, we don't feel, I wouldn't say a tension, but we are very unique. There's only 3 breweries in the state of Oregon that are on working farms. And we have a working hazelnut farm, and that is something that is really exciting to see and observe. And we use the hazelnuts in our beer. I have a beer in the tank right now that's going to be bottled tomorrow, which has hazelnuts from the farm. And so that beer, though, will probably be served in Portland restaurants. And I'm totally okay with that.
Well, Bronwen, I feel like your book addressed this issue. There are all these small farms like Christians that are producing these delicious products and bringing more money into these small economies, and yet kind of the way the political climate is right now, it seems like their work is sort of imperiled in some ways. Are you finding that in the UK?
Yeah, it's amazing the extent to which themes that pop up here are actually the same ones that we're grappling with on the other side of the Atlantic. And this whole idea of the estrangement of people who live in cities from the realities of working in a rural, the realities of where food comes from, to be honest. And that there is something. One of the key themes in our book is actually putting the farming back into cheesemaking, that it's very possible to think of cheesemaking as this process that can be done anywhere, and you just take milk and you put it through a process, you make cheese with it, and then it's sort of the magic is in the cheesemaking. But actually, the more that we have learned, the more we see that actually the magic is in the farming, and the cheesemaking is just a way that you hopefully don't mess it up. And I think really putting the emphasis back on the farming side and the flavors that you can only get through good farming, and the way in which cheese is this vehicle that can take the flavors of that farm and transfer them to the middle of a city thousands of miles away, where we can then experience that for ourselves as consumers, is like the ultimate way to sort of maybe redevelop a discourse between these two communities that are really having trouble communicating with one another.
I think absolutely. This, as Bronwen was saying, this is a tension within the progressive food movement itself, actually. The idea where you see in a progressive city, somewhere like Portland, we see it a lot in London, where the food movement wants to be ever increasingly locavore. The idea that we will eat local food, that local is an inherently good quality. And a lot of these traditional, often fermented forms of preserving the food are designed around making it transportable. It's what we say, cheese is a spaceship for milk. It helps if you're a Doctor Who fan, but it is a vehicle for transporting it through time and space. And it allows you to farm where it's best to farm, and then go out and find the market, which might even be in another country, where someone will pay you the premium that you deserve for all of this effort that you're putting in. And it's what we say with cheese, it's process local, process on the farm, make your cheese on the farm, retain that added value, but then eat global.
Well, wait a minute. I read an article that was stating that rural dwellers in the UK were more likely to have voted for Brexit.
Entirely. It's the same demographics as with Trump.
Bronwen, you're a cheese importer and exporter, aren't you?
Well, mostly exporter, to be honest. And the interesting thing about, I mean, we could go granular on this, and we might well, but if you ask the farmer, they might say, well, actually, the pound sterling has really collapsed in value since Brexit, and that's made it much cheaper to export cheese because British cheese has suddenly got less expensive. The thing that they're forgetting is actually our biggest export market is Europe. And the thing that we really depend on right now is being able to send all of their cheeses, to our friends and our colleagues who live on the continent. And by imperiling that free trade arrangement, they're taking away the access from the people who want their cheeses the most and whose money is going to come in to farm their laudable farming practices. And, I think we're living in an increasingly global world. And if people are producing products that are truly unique and wonderful, and I think in many, many cases these cheesemakers are, that actually the world in which we have the global, the global community and the capacity for these rural products to have meaning in urban centers around the world is the one in which that's the economic system that's going to protect the future of these small businesses.
But I think, just to add to what Bronwen has said, there is a broken conversation. The number of awkward conversations or conversations deliberately not had around farmhouse tables when you are in my case, the metropolitan journalist visiting the farmer, where I certainly have self-consciously steered conversations away from politics because there is a fundamental. We get it a lot in London. The UK is such a heavily centralised country that for me, as a very proud native Londoner, going out into the provincial UK and sitting down, and I have sat through a lot of lectures about how London is a bad place, how London is somewhere where we do not understand the trials and tribulations of the everyday rural working folk.
Well, and I think they're making a good point that many people living in, who I work with, who are living in these very rural areas, feel that they've been forgotten by the cosmopolitan communities where there's a lot of money and where essentially that conversation is a really broken one. And actually, what the great opportunity here is that the things that they're making have tremendous value to that audience. And if we can construct that dialogue, actually maybe they can feel that they're part of the conversation again and really revitalize those rural communities.
This is the irony, is that the best way to redistribute wealth from these rural from the thriving global metropolis to struggling rural places in the UK, in the US, is through these high value-added fancy foods that you sell to fancy people.
Spaceships.
Exactly, spaceships. And I think the US is a great example of this. If I think of perhaps Matteo Keeler, of Jasper Hill and the cellars at Jasper Hill in Vermont, his background is actually in development economics, and he is most proud of not of the wonderful cheeses he has made, but that through making these cheeses, through starting this cheese business, he is regenerating the economy of his very much backwater in northern Vermont. And I think we need more exercises like that and understanding it in exactly those terms.
And I might add, just one quick thing is preserving farmland from factories. Frankly, the more artisanal and smaller operations you have, you're literally preserving land in a thoughtful and usually a way that doesn't involve truckloads full of pesticide.
Absolutely.
I love ending on that note. We've got to zoom through our dessert course, but I can't wait to hear what you all brought. Christian, did you bring a little dessert to share with all of us?
Well, I did. In addition to the beer, I just want to say my dessert of choice these days is filberts. We call them filberts, but they're marketed as hazelnuts. And these days, I've just been enjoying them. They're harvested in the fall, and we eat them throughout the fall and winter. Filberts, they're one of my favorite things.
And do you toast them?
You can, yeah. They're really good with some salt as well.
Yeah.
We cut them up on a salad, chop them, put on some salmon. Those are kind of classic ways to use them, but yeah, they're delicious just about any way.
Thank you. Filberts are such a classic Oregon flavor. I love them. Francis, what did you bring to share
So I'm
with us?
going to be a little bit controversial in the Pacific Northwest, but I think it reflects a lot of the things that we've talked about today, and go for some Maine Grains flour. From Skowhegan in the centre of Maine. And it's an amazing project where a woman called Amber Lampke has bought up the local county jail and converted it into a grist mill, and then persuaded a lot of Maine potato farmers that growing organic grains, that she then mills tremendously well. And the level of milling there is better than anything I have access to in the United Kingdom, and sells around the Northeast. I've actually got 15 pounds of flour to be delivered to us for me to take home to London, because it has a quality, particularly to these really high extraction flours, that you can make something that's almost 100% wholemeal, but that still has a wonderful open texture if you use it for baking bread. And it's a perfect example of something which is healing that urban-rural divide and an exercise in rural regeneration, and is fantastically delicious.
Ooh, that sounds wonderful. Bronwen, what did you bring?
I brought some chocolate. And I think, again, in playing around with these themes of spaceships, of taking things that are grown in one place and tasting them around the world, but also in terms of fermented foods that really can capture a sense of place. Bertil Akesson has an estate in Madagascar, and he makes some of my favorite chocolates in the world, single origin chocolates, and particularly one in which is 100% chocolate, so completely unsweetened, which is intensely fruity, and that there are layers and layers of flavor within it. And as someone who had many bad experiences as a child, where I found the baker's chocolate, unsweetened chocolate that my mother would use for making brownies in the cupboard, and thought that I would have a snack on that, and was repelled by this 100% chocolate, to discover 100% chocolate that's actually something that I would want to eat for pleasure and is intensely delicious and expressive of its raw materials, is something that I would heartily recommend to anyone.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Well, I feel like I don't have enough time to say enough good things about the two books I brought. Both written by friends in the industry, Meehan's Bartender Manual by Jim Meehan and The New Wine Rules by John Bonet. These are the best beverage books I have seen all year. And not only, I could go on and on about why the contents of these books are great, but what I love is the design. Both of them harken back to, I want to say, the 1930s. They remind me of books on my grandparents' shelf, on my parents' shelf. I remember I would get these books and I would take the dust cover off, the dust jacket off, and realize that the book underneath was really beautiful on its own. That's what these books look like to me. John Bonet's book actually looks like the original Penguin series that came out in the 1930s. Do you guys remember these?
Absolutely.
Same color of tomato.
Yeah, it looks like it should be something the latest from D.H. Lawrence, and you should be a little bit scandalized that your servant is reading it.
Yes. Anyway, I'll probably talk about these books again, but just look at them and just enjoy their design. I think they're just beautiful. Anyway, we've got to move on, sadly. A special thanks to the brilliant minds who joined us in the studio today. Bronwen Percival, who initiated the Biennial Science of Artisan Cheese Conference and is the co-founder of the website microbialfoods.org, in addition to all the other stuff I mentioned at the beginning of the show. Same thing goes for Francis. You're so accomplished, I don't even know how many things I can list here.
I am much less interesting than Bronwen.
I will say Francis has won the Louis Roederer International Wine Columnist of the Year Award and the Pio Cesare Wine and Food Writer of the Year Award. And both of you together, I think I mentioned this before, co-founded the London Gastronomy Seminars. And Christian Debenedetti, who before becoming a nationally recognized brewer, wrote for national publications like Outside Magazine, National Geographic Adventure, Men's Journal, Food and Wine, Bon Appetit. You write books. You guys, I'm just awed by all of you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you very much.
Today's episode was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, at the studios of OPB. You can read all about us on the OPB website. Our producer is Alex Ward. Special thanks to OPB sound supervisor Stephen Cray. And our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer Kermit Lynch. If you like our James Beard Award-winning show, please help us out. Rate us on iTunes. Subscribe to The Four Top on your favorite podcast app. And please tell your friends about us. You can tweet us at @4top, all one word, or visit our Facebook page and post your thoughts about the show. We'd love to hear from you. Bye.
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit blanche.
If I dumped a load of feces in a cup of milk and then pasteurized it for you, it would be completely safe. But would you want to eat it?